In 1971, an astronaut named Edgar Mitchell was flying home from the moon when he looked out the window and started crying, and he had no idea why. But that's not actually the strange part of his story. The strange part is what he became convinced had happened to him, a belief so far outside conventional science that NASA quietly steered him away from repeating it in public for years. So, what actually happens to a person's mind the moment they see the whole Earth at once? And why did it push one of the most rational men NASA ever trained towards something that sounds almost mystical? Mitchell was the sixth man to walk on the moon, a fighter pilot and an engineer, not someone prone to unexplained tears. On the return trip to Earth, the capsule rotated slowly to control its temperature, and every few minutes the window filled with the moon, then black space, then the sun, then Earth. A small blue marble hanging alone in absolute darkness. No borders visible, no countries, no lines. Just one solid, fragile looking sphere. He said later that something broke open in him at that sight. A certainty that every war, every argument, every border he'd ever taken seriously suddenly looked small enough to hold in one hand. Here's the part most retellings leave out. Mitchell didn't just feel moved, he came home convinced that what he'd experienced was evidence of something literal, that every particle of matter in the universe, including the one making up his own body, was connected to every other particle in a way modern physics hadn't yet mapped. Not a metaphor, not a spiritual turn of phrase. He believed he had directly perceived it. 2 years later, he founded a research institute to study consciousness itself, and spent the rest of his life trying to get science to take that moment as seriously as he did. Most of his colleagues never followed him there, but nobody could explain why the moment had hit him quite that hard either. A decade after his flight, a writer and philosopher named Frank White set out to answer that question by going straight to the source. He interviewed dozens of astronauts and found the same story over and over, told by people who had never spoken to each other. Test pilots, scientists, military officers trained specifically not to be emotionally rattled by their job. All of them describing some version of the same collapse, the same sudden, overwhelming sense that the boundaries they'd spent their whole lives believing in were an illusion built entirely on the ground. White gave it a name in 1987. The overview effect. Here's the first assumption that turns out to be wrong. You'd assume this feeling is universally peaceful, a kind of instant enlightenment that arrives gently. For a portion of astronauts, that is not how it starts at all. Several have described the initial seconds not as peace, but as something closer to a jolt of vertigo, a genuine loss of orientation so sharp it registers almost as fear before it resolves into calm. The brain, confronted with a sight it has no evolutionary reference point for, doesn't always know at first whether to file it as beautiful or as a threat. Only after that first disorienting jolt does it settle into what most people describe afterward. So what is actually happening mechanically in that shift? From the surface of Earth, the horizon curves so gently you can convince yourself the world goes on forever in every direction. From orbit, that illusion is physically impossible to maintain. You watch the sun rise and set every 90 minutes. You watch entire continents pass beneath you in the time it takes to eat a meal. Weather systems, coastlines, the visible thinness of the atmosphere itself, a fragile blue line no thicker than the skin on an apple, protecting every person who has ever lived. Astronaut after astronaut singles out that exact detail, not the stars, not the vastness of space, but the thinness of the air. Apollo astronaut Rusty Schweickart described looking down and realizing the layer keeping every living thing alive looked thin enough to be wiped away with a thumb. He said he could never again think of Earth as something solid and permanent. It looked, in his words, achingly fragile. For years, this was treated as a beautiful but unprovable story, impossible to measure. Then researchers tried anyway, using structured psychological interviews instead of open conversation, hunting for patterns that could be tested rather than just described. What they found lined up with something already documented in a completely different field, the psychology of awe. Awe, in a clinical sense, is what happens when you encounter something so vast your existing mental categories can't process it. Researchers studying astronauts found the overview effect produces the most intense, measurable version of that response ever recorded. And awe does something specific to the brain. It quiets a network of regions tied to self-focus, the same network responsible for the constant internal monologue about your own status, your own problems, your own place in the pecking order. When that network goes quiet, people report feeling smaller and more connected to everyone else at the same moment, which raises the second wrong assumption. You'd expect seeing the entire planet from outside of it would make a person feel insignificant in a painful way, a speck lost in a void. Almost nobody reports it that way. Astronaut Ron Garan called it the orbital perspective, the sudden physical understanding that all 7 billion people alive at that moment were riding through space together on the same fragile object, sharing the same thin blue line of air, whether they'd ever agreed on anything or not. From 400 kilometers up, every conflict on the surface looked, in his words, absurd. So if this response is sitting there in the human brain, available to be triggered, why can't we just trigger it? Photographs of Earth from space, the famous ones, Earthrise, the blue marble, are stunning, but nobody bursts into tears looking at a photo the way Mitchell did looking out a real window. Researchers tried recreating the experience using virtual reality headsets and simulated orbital views and got a real but noticeably smaller version of the same brain response, like hearing a song through a wall instead of standing in the room. Whatever is happening to astronauts appears to require the body knowing, on some physical level, that the vastness in front of it is not a simulation, that it is real, and that there is no glass and no headset standing between them and the actual edge of everything they know. That is the uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this for the rest of us, the billions of people who will likely never get the unfiltered version. Are we simply locked out of the most profound perspective shift a human mind can experience? Maybe not entirely. Because what researchers say is actually happening in that moment. The quieting of the self-focused network, the sudden collapse of perceived distance between yourself and everyone else, is not unique to space. It's a more extreme version of something available in smaller, real doses right here. Standing somewhere vast enough to make you feel your own smallness and mean it. A mountain ridge at night, an ocean with no visible edge, a sky clear enough to show the actual density of the stars instead of the handful the city normally allows through. The astronauts didn't invent this response. They found the single most powerful trigger for it that has ever existed, which brings the story back to Mitchell and the belief that outlived him. He spent decades trying to convince a skeptical scientific establishment that what he felt in that capsule wasn't a chemical accident of stress and awe, but a real, direct perception of a connection between everything that exists one modern instruments simply hadn't caught up to yet. Most physicists disagreed with him until the day he died, but even his harshest critics never disputed the one thing that actually mattered, that something real happened to him at that window, measurable in every astronaut who came after him, whether or not anyone can fully explain why. He came home from that trip and spent the rest of his life trying to describe a single moment. A blue marble hanging alone in the dark, no lines on it anywhere. Maybe the lines were never really there to begin with, and maybe that's the part that should unsettle you a little. Not the vastness of space, but how easily every border down here convinces you it's real.